Everybody, please welcome writer, director Morgan Neville.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome, Morgan.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
It's worth saying, because you know this, that I grew up in Santa Barbara. I grew up coming to this theater, and to come back here means a lot. I know my grade school teacher and sometimes babysitter, Debbie, is here somewhere. And so it's kind of a homecoming for me. So thank you all for coming.
Oh, it's also a homecoming for us because it's the first time after 20 months that we have an in-person screening here. And the fact that it's you that is here, it's very special. So thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm getting emotional. Oh my goodness.
It's an emotional film, no doubt. So.
One of the things that I was blown away when I was watching this film, and I'm pretty sure it had to do with the editing, is that we know the ending, we know where it's going, but every sequence, every moment of this film feels so present, like the ending, like he's alive, and I just wondering, editing-wise, how were you able to achieve that?
I mean, I knew that would be one of the challenges of the film because the end of the film is so preordained that I didn't want the film to feel like a eulogy, you know, and I feel like, especially making the film so soon after he died, we started shooting the first interviews about 16 months after he died, and I shot interviews for a year, but there was often just like a heaviness to it, and I didn't want the whole film to feel that we're all reading the story backwards through the prism of his death. I wanted it to be lived forwards. And so when we got into editing, I said to my first editor, Eileen Meyer, we had two editors, I said, we're gonna start at the beginning of the film, and we're not gonna think about anything that happened at the end of Tony's life. We're not gonna look at those parts of the interviews, it's just off the table. And we're gonna cut the first scene, and then we're gonna cut the second scene, and we just cut sequentially from the beginning of the film for 4 or 5 months. And that part of the story is amazing. I mean, it's energetic and exciting, and him finding out who he is as a famous person, having this life transformation, and we found all this incredible footage of him before his TV show from a local photographer who had started making an aborted documentary about him. But he had 60 hours of footage of Tony, that early footage of Tony on the book tour. It was literally, he started shooting the week the book came out. So it was, you know, so fortunate for us to have that. But then we put together the first 45 minutes of the film, and I screened it for my producer. And she said, it's great, but I forgot he died. And I thought, well, that was kind of the purpose of it. But at the same time, if the whole film did that, it wouldn't work because you'd be wondering, are you ever going to get there? And so I put that beat at the beginning where we just acknowledge it. In other words, we'll get there. You know, don't worry about that. We'll go on the journey though, from the beginning. And so that every scene had this kind of propulsion into the next scene, and it all just kept growing and growing and growing. And, you know, there were insane amounts of footage we had to deal with, which is, again, both a blessing and a little bit of a curse, but, you know, something like 20,000 hours were available to us. I think we went through about 10,000 hours. And just trying to look for needles and haystacks of little moments. And
you make a choice of not dwelling on what happened before Kitchen Confidential, the book, and also even what is covered in the book. You start as right at the point where this person at 40 plus years old becomes famous. 44. Can you tell us about that choice?
Part of it was, it's a huge story to tell, and I couldn't do it all. But also to tell the Kitchen Confidential part, basically up until where the film begins, he did so well, you know, in reading that book, and to kind of talk to people, and I actually interviewed several people, and I was experimenting, trying to figure out where the story would begin. But I started to feel like me telling all the early Kitchen year stories was a little bit like a greatest hits album of kind of, remember that story from the book? Well, I'm going to tell it to you again. Or remember his friend? Here he is. And it just, and also there was zero footage, so there were a number of challenges that it made that part of the story both feel told, but also not what you were talking about, which is alive and active. So I said, it's really, to me, then, this story of somebody who in middle age is given everything they always kind of dreamt about, the chance to travel, the chance to have money, all these opportunities, this life transformation, and kind of what he does with it. That's so unusual for somebody to have that kind of transformation in their 40s, and he was 44 when the book was published. And so you see the end of that Kitchen Confidential era, the end of his kitchen years at the beginning of the film. And then he has this transformation, and then he has this other transformation. It's him trying to figure out who can I be normal? Can I be all these things? And him kind of grappling with things that, as confounding as things like fame are for him, the issues existed before. I mean, even just going back, for those of you who have or haven't read Kitchen Confidential, going back and rereading that to make this film, it's really dark. I mean, it talks about his years as a heroin addict, as a cocaine addict, mental health issues. He talks about his, he has this kind of extraordinary passage where he talks about imagining getting hit in the street by an ice cream truck. And he says, say I get hit by an ice cream truck and I'm dying in the gutter and they're pulling the bumper out of my head. Am I going to regret that I didn't eat this thing or travel to this place or have this experience? No. The only thing I'm going to regret is the people I let down in my life who cared for me. And he wrote that when he was 43. I mean, this kind of sense of like the story's over, and the kinds of issues he was grappling with were there before this whole story began. That again, it's more about finding these threads so that you can reconcile who he was at the beginning and who he was at the end, that those aren't necessarily two entirely different people. It's one person dealing with this kind of mosaic of problems.
We're used to, in literature and in cinema at times, a romanticizing of suicide, and there is so much bitterness in this film and anger about it. Can you tell us about that approach of, not romanticizing in any way?
I do think Tony was a little guilty of romanticizing it. I mean, he had this kind of live fast, die young attitude and the love of kind of the rock star swagger, but he made jokes about suicide all the time. In one of his books, he tells this story about this, maybe in around 2005, after he'd split up from his first wife and before he met Otavia, where he was driving on a mountain road in Saint Martin in the Caribbean after many drinks and was feeling very depressed and wanted to drive off the cliff. And that was his intention. And as he was driving on this road to do that, at the last minute, the Chambers Brothers song, A Time Has Come Today, came on. And something about hearing the tick-tock at the beginning of that song like snapped him back and he turned the wheel, which says a lot of things. Part of it is that these are issues he's been grappling with for a long time, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. There's also part of that like that's a story. Like there's something that's, I don't know if it happened exactly like that, but that's, to me, a kind of elevated way of talking about thinking about killing yourself in this kind of dramatic story. So he certainly was somebody who, and many of his friends told me this, was kind of a suicidologist. He could tell you everybody who had committed suicide, famous people and how, and it was always something that was kind of maybe seemed, possible. It was certainly something that was more in his mind than your average person.
But I don't recall seeing such raw anger. I mean, seeing the aftermath of hearing his friends and colleagues and co-workers that you capture so vividly in this documentary there is so painful to...
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it is painful, and that really was just a reflection of my experience of making the film. I think if I'd made the film in 5 years, it wouldn't be as raw. But what I found when I sat down with all these people was incredible grief and raw emotion still that they were processing things as we were talking, as I was making the film, and this has all been a process to this day of people in his life who, I felt blessed that they would give me the kind of access and vulnerability and trust to have these honest conversations about it. So part of it, really, when I first started thinking about making this film, my first thought was, who's my audience? I thought, well, Tony. And part of it was I wanted him to feel like he would recognize himself in the film. And so I started a playlist of songs he mentioned. I ended up with this playlist. It's now up to 21 hours of songs of everything he mentioned. And every song in the film came from that. And he was a movie fanatic, so all of his list of his favorite movies, I'd go back and look at all of them. Many of them made it, and they're that DNA of it. The books, from Graham Greene to George Orwell to Hunter Thompson and Joseph Conrad, on and on. Just trying to absorb all of that energy to get it in the film. But there was a certain point in making the film, in doing the interviews, where I realized, well, there's part of this story that maybe Tony shouldn't like, which is, the crater he left behind. And because that's what I saw so evidently in doing the film. And I just felt like, having gone through that very intense experience of making it, I couldn't just say, that was sad, and move on.
And Morgan, it's not just the crater that he left within the closed people, but also with the audience in general, because it was monumental for the world in general when we heard of his passing. And this film feels to me like almost like a cathartic experience for the audience vis-a-vis that.
I hope so. I thought about it that way because, when I started making the film and I would tell somebody I was working on this film, a very common reaction would be, Anthony Bourdain, I just loved him. This like heavy sigh, and lots of people saying, I can't watch his show anymore. I just don't know what happened. People just feeling sad and unsure of what to think. So people just pushing them out of their mind, just like put it in a box, which is how so many people deal with tragedy, but particularly suicide is something we don't talk about, and just saying, okay, I'm just going to put it away in a box and not think about it.
It's good to hear you say that was part of your intention, because while I was watching the film, the reconciling of the people that we thought we knew with the person that committed suicide, you bridge in the film, watching it, you bridge that gap.
And I was looking for those things to feel like, again, like I was even saying in, these in Kitchen Confidential, but early on, it's very consistent in a lot of ways. I know emotionally he had ups and downs, but it's no secret that he had demons. He wrote about them very well, not just in Kitchen Confidential. He wrote, I think, 9 books total. A couple of memoirs, 3 mysteries, a book about Typhoid Mary, a few other things. But and his writing is much kind of rawer and darker, obviously, than the television show.
I was going to ask you about the music later on, but the fact that you brought it up, I don't want it for us to forget it and be fresh in your mind, is the fact that we're used to, having a sequence be underscore, but music becomes almost another character in the story where, it's not just underscore for a few sequences, it actually carries on throughout, a broader aspect. Can you tell us about?
I think part of that is I've done so many music films. That's part of my thinking, and I'm a musician. I love music, and to me, if music, my training in music films is that you don't just stick in songs because they're good. They have to tell a story. How does the song drive the story or reveal character? So songs like that, Ruichi Sakamoto, the theme for Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, that Tony, in some of his Instagram stories, when he would post a video of himself in a hotel room, say, he did this sometimes. And sometimes he didn't know how to put the music on the track, so he would play music with his computer and hold the phone there, so he was playing, so he could get the song on, so he'd cue it up and get it right. And he had used that song and had talked about how much he loved that song. And I'd always loved that song. And then going back and rewatching that movie and have that clip of David Bowie and the boy talking about leaving and coming back, and that's like a song that actually becomes something that starts to mean a lot of different things in a way. It's not just score. It's something that I think is revealing about him.
When the title of the documentary is Roadrunner, which is, comes from the song, when did that all come together for you?
That was like the first week. That was one of those things that I always loved that song. I knew he loved that song. And I just remember thinking, Roadrunner. We should open the movie with that song, call the movie Roadrunner. And it's just one of those ideas you have at the beginning. We cut that very early on. And then we tried to replace it for about 6 months. I tried so many different songs, so many different titles. Just like it's one of those, it can't be that easy kind of moments of like, it just can't be that thing. But it was that kind of Occam's razor moment where like, okay, maybe it is that. And then I really grew to, I always really liked it. I think it was a lot of my editors and everybody being like, really? That's it? Just, it can't be that easy. And I remember, when I started telling people, our distributor and other people, I'm going to call it Roadrunner, I think there was a certain amount of head scratching, really? The cartoon? What's this have to do with that? And but I think when you see the film in context, it actually starts to make a lot of sense.
It's actually haunting. You talked about having all these archival footage. One, I find it mind-boggling that when he first starts going on tour with a book and you see this deer cut in the headlights look about him, that I saw in credits that it was Dimitri Castorine that shot those. How, when did you get access to those?
So that was this photographer, and he's still alive. He's older than Tony, and I don't think he'd ever made a documentary before. At some point he said, oh, can I follow you around? This is right when Kitchen Confidential was coming out. And actually, there was an excerpt that the New Yorker published. It was not exactly an excerpt, but a kind of a chapter of Kitchen Confidential that was published in the New Yorker before the book called Don't Eat Before You Read This. And that got a lot of attention. So I think Dimitri probably was thinking, oh, there's something good in this story. Let me follow you around. He followed Tony around, filmed for a year, and then Tony suddenly was off doing his TV show, and the film never got finished. So very early on, I knew this footage existed. It wasn't a total surprise because they had done a flashback episode of No Reservation in like 2008 where they had used a tiny bit of the footage. And one of the producers had said, oh yeah, there was this guy that had shot this footage. So, he literally sent us a shoebox full of little mini DV tapes, and we digitized it. And that was like, oh my God, 60 hours of your subject in kind of this most transformational year of their life. It was just one of those gifts.
One of the illuminating things when I was watching the documentary is that I thought of him as a chef or a cook, and to find out that he was such an incredible writer and consider himself a writer, and then that he's such a knowledgeable cinephile. How did understanding that help you dive into the work?
He was a culture vulture, I guess is the term, of somebody who just watched movies, read incredibly quickly and many books and retained everything, and had certain areas, he was an expert in, post-war espionage, say, certain, like probably one of the leading experts, and because other people said he would meet an academic and he would blow them away with how much he knew about these things, So, but also travel, a lot of stuff really about U.S. colonialism and international colonialism and kind of the legacy and hangover of colonialism. He was really shaped by the Vietnam War protests that his parents took him to, and he graduated high school in '73. So he was coming of age right at that peak kind of sourness at the end of the '60s and the early '70s. And I think that actually was shaped him more than his family per se, in terms of a lot of his kind of tastes and attitudes about things. That and a
how
lot
did
of
that-
access to LSD at a very young age.
But all of that, how did it, knowing all of that, how did it obviously shape your approach to the film, because you take this Sunset Boulevard approach that it's a man telling his own
and
story.
Sunset Boulevard was the first idea I had for it. So when I actually went in to meet with everybody, to meet with his second wife and his agent and everybody, I thought about Sunset Boulevard. I knew Tony had loved that movie. He had even recreated some of it in Cook's Tour. And the idea of making a film about him and not having his voice in it seemed strange, because his voice was kind of the thing that made his show. You know, if you take his voice out of those episodes, they're a little melancholy and kind of, they have a very different character to them. And so much of this is influenced by his point of view. I mean, he always wrote about himself. Even his shows were about his subjective point of view. So I had this idea of having him narrate it. I didn't know. I ended up going through every interview, every podcast, every voiceover session, every book, and stitching together things. There's a little bit of controversy this week about some artificial intelligence I
Went
used,
there. I wasn't going to go there.
which I talked about from the beginning with everybody. And
It's not a big deal.
well, at the end of the day, it's 45 seconds total. That's it. And there were a couple of things he wrote that were like a passage about Vietnam, about falling in love with Vietnam, which was just a beautiful passage that he had never said out loud. So I was like, well, let me try it. You know?
For those who don't know, is that Morgan actually grabbed words that Bourdain said, and then he had them artificially engineered to feel like it's him talking. But it's a non. It's not.
I understand.
If you had rewritten his words,
I get it, and I understand that, you know, deep fake technology is like a scary thing, but I actually feel like, knowing how, I've had calls from lots of documentary filmmakers who know how the sausage gets made, and there's something, you know, often people talk about Frankenbiting, where you chop together what somebody said to make them say something, and like that happens all the time in documentary. And I actually think that's in many ways more problematic in terms of how people actually manipulate words to get people to say things. So, you know, I get it. It's provocative, but I kind of felt like Tony was the guy who was, remember, you know, it's like, be as out on the edge creatively as you always can be. And so, you know, when I make films, I often say, you know, my line is, the instructions are in the box. You know, when you're making a film about somebody, you look at how they see the world, and that's how you tell the film. A film about Mr. Rogers is simple and pure and deep and loving. A film about Orson Welles is smart and kind of chaotic and ironic at times. And a film about Bourdain is about gray areas, totally. Yeah. That's where he found, I mean, the nuance, I mean, I think he said, or somebody said he said this, but I like the line that nuance is pornography for smart people. And
there are some striking. There's some striking.
I like that. And nuance is hard in this day and age of you know, 145 characters.
And you do this, like, I was blown away by the contrast that you bring up, where you have him being very, you know, an empath when it comes to the Beirut situation and the Congo, but then becomes incredibly narcissistic about the way he handles the firing his staff to the Argento. Were you aware of showing those contradictions and
I mean, it's a very typical thing that he ran his show like he ran a kitchen, and the way he ran kitchens was like how he came up in the kitchen. You know, the way people, I mean, to this day, but particularly in the 70s and 80s, coming up in a European-style kitchen, you know, he studied at CIA, the Culinary Institute of America. You know, you don't get a lot of praise and pats on the head, you know, working in those types of kitchens. You know, it's really kind of abusive behavior. However, there's a sense of, as much as I may, you know, be tough on you. We're in this together, and I'll take a bullet for you, and you'll take a bullet for me. You know, it's almost a more militaristic, or as he would say, the pirate model. You know, that we're on the pirate ship, and I'm the captain, but we're all, as much as, you know, we may fight, we're going to all look out for each other. And so you see, in spite of how tough he could be on the people around him, they worked with him for years. They didn't leave. I mean, they got the sense of purpose. They were there for year after year after year, you know, and they loved him. And part of it is, too, when he was being tough on somebody, he was always tougher on himself. He wasn't doing it just to crap on people. He was doing it because he was asking so much of himself and trying to do something better. So I think they got that. And, you know, but there is this contrast with that and his sensitivity, his humanism, you know, where he could be so gentle, you know, and so, I mean, there's so many episodes where it's just, you know, he's talking to some grandma making, you know, mole, and, you know, I've seen all these things. It's just like beautiful, you know, and they're all part of him. I mean, he was a very complex person who always showed slightly different versions of himself to everybody. You know, he was, even his crews, he had different, all of them said he had totally different relationships with all of them. You know, one could be the stern father, one could be the older brother, one could be the, you know, the friend, you know, but that he was always kind of shape-shifting a little bit.
How much of an asset was it, the fact that you didn't know him?
I think it's an asset I didn't know him well. You know, there's no way I could have made it if I knew him well. And in fact, you know, all the people who helped me on the film, from the producers and all the people that work with them, the people at CNN, the woman, Amy Antelis, who was the head of, I guess, all programming at CNN. She's the one that brought Bourdan to CNN. And she's my executive producer. All of them said, we have no idea how to tell this story. Like, we don't know. We're all way too close to it. You have distance. Go and make your film, you know. And they gave me final cut, and I got to make exactly what I wanted. I mean, it was insanely difficult because there's so many challenges with the film like this. You know, not only wrestling with a character like this, but wrestling with a tragedy like this and a public persona who so many people have so many strong feelings about, and trying to also not get carried away with expectations of people saying, oh, I was like this about Tony, why am I not seeing this, or this episode, or this Kitchen Confidential, or whatever, you know, that it couldn't, like I said, it couldn't pander to the audience. It had to just tell its own story, you know, and really, you know, at the end of the day, the thing I just kept coming back to was this psychological profile. What was Tony thinking? How did he become who he was? I mean, that's why I ended up sticking that by. I'd forgotten I'd said that to John Lurie when I'd interviewed him at the beginning. He's like, why are you making this film? You know, it's not about his death. And I said, no, it's because I'm trying to figure out why he was who he was, which really was kind of my constant marching order, you know, scene by scene.
But you came in at a moment that most of them had not processed his death and his suicide. That must have been really hard on you it must have been like therapy sessions.
Very
with
much so.
this,
Very much.
you know.
Yeah. And also because a lot of people in the film, and again, we filmed for years, so I filmed up from 16 months to, you know, 2 years and 4 months, you know, past his death. And even in that time, seeing how people were changing. I mean, there's one story, his agent said that right after he died, there was a suicide prevention organization that asked her for permission to use his name on a campaign for suicide prevention. Mm. And she said, no, Tony would have hated that. A year later, while we were making the film, they came back to her, or another organization, asking for the same thing, for a suicide prevention. Can we use his name? She started to say no, and then she stopped herself and said, you know what? Tony doesn't get to say. It's no longer his decision. You know, and I thought that was healthy, that people can understand that they can act for themselves. They can feel what they want to feel. They don't have to just try and please him. And people just feeling that they have some agency, because so much of what suicide does is make people feel helpless. I saw so much guilt and shame and all those kinds of things that suicide evokes. And a lot of times I would talk to people about, I mean, even not even on camera, just about that, and saying, you know that's not on you. You know, and they said, I know that intellectually, but emotionally is another matter. And that's the thing that I thought was true of a lot of people I talked to, which is, I think they understood it intellectually how to think about it, but I think emotions are another matter that you can't control. And so me sitting down with people and saying, tell me everything you're feeling and let's just talk. I mean, Chris and Lydia, the husband and wife couple who were his longtime producing partners, Lydia, when she sat down with me, said, I've never talked to my husband about this, just because when he died, they scrambled to figure out what their company was and everything they were doing, and that it's like, how often do you feel like, oh, I can just sit down and we can have a really tough, really long conversation about everything we're feeling? They just hadn't. So she talked to me first, and it was the same with Chris. So in the way, I actually feel like the film was therapy for everybody, not just the audience and not just them, me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you do help people process, an audience member help process his loss, and you don't give answers, and that's actually one of the things that I greatly admire about the film, is that you don't directly answer why, which is one of the reasons why I respected deeply the fact that you don't dwell on Argento, you don't interview her directly. Can you, tell us about not interviewing her directly?
Well, it'd get really easy to start litigating who did this and when, and if you've read much about the story, it gets really complicated in a way that actually doesn't tell you anything more about Tony and what he was thinking. And I really, at the beginning, didn't want to make a film about his death, that's only so avoidable. And the gray area, again, it's the gray, that, I found this quote that Tony said after I finished the film, which is very indicative of his thinking, which is, most of the world's problems are the result of people trying to find a simple fucking answer. And I think that idea of binary thinking, that it's this way or that way, it's good or evil, this is why he killed himself, check the box. It's not Tony and it's not real, and I think my films are actually much more about questions. Won't You Be My Neighbor ends on a question, Many scenes in that film end on questions. I think it was more respectful of the audience too, to engage them, because that means they're part of the conversation about what we're all learning together. And that's something that Tony totally got. We were, that's one of those things I was like, he knows the trick. He knows how, that's what I think good storytelling can be too. So, I definitely was inspired by that.
He obviously had very addictive tendencies, and you focus on the jiu-jitsu and his work ethic and et cetera, et cetera. Tell us about how you calibrated that information, the fact of the jiu-jitsu and the...
that was just, we had a debate about how much we're going to go into that, but it was just so indicative of his obsessiveness about everything, that, and just hearing his crew particularly react to just how obsessive he was about it, that it was just somebody who never wanted to do anything half-assed, who was always just all in. And that could be great, his work, he talks about it, about the kitchen, was the rigors of the kitchen were the thing that kind of kept him on the straight and narrow. He was, everybody said, the most punctual human they ever met. If you were supposed to meet him at 7 a.m., he'd be there at 6:30. That he was, and if somebody was 1 minute late, he was deeply offended. Like he was, but part of it is, I think, those years of, abuse of drugs and drink and whatever else, if he knew he had to be at the kitchen at whatever time and he was not going to be late, that the rigors of that kept him, kind of locked. He couldn't go too far, and that kind of workaholism, really, which is like one of the last socially acceptable addictions, is this thing that really kept him. I mean, you saw how, he traveled 250, sometimes 270 days a year. He did so much work, and even when he wasn't shooting the show, he'd do book tours, he'd do lecture tours, he would shoot other shows in between. And he never slowed down at all. I mean, in his contract, he had a clause put in saying he could do fewer episodes for no real penalty. He got a book contract to take a sabbatical in Vietnam for a year and write a book, which he had always fantasized about, and Philippe kind of refers to that they always had this fantasy of, I'm just going to live in a shack on the water in Vietnam. That was like his happy place, in a hammock with a Mai Tai. And he had a contract to do that, to write a book, for good money. He could have done it. But he never did one fewer episode. He never did any of that. I mean, maybe it was the possibility of, I could do that, was enough for him to feel like he didn't actually have to do it. But that, again, that momentum of the next thing, I think was something that he felt kept him in line.
I don't want to make light of the amount of work that took for you to edit this piece. I mean, you had hours upon hours of archival footage that you needed to go through and start shaping into what we saw. Can you tell us, the process that?
Well, there were 6 of us going through footage, so.
But did you do like a big, long take of all the stuff? Or
no,
did you
I mean,
start...
I think how we started is there were certain episodes that certainly floated the top, like episodes that he always talked about being really meaningful for him, whether it was Libya or Iran or, Cuba, Haiti, some of the ones in the film, some of the ones not in the film, just Beirut, Congo. I mean, so we're like, well, let's definitely start with all those, and then in doing the interviews, we'd always say, what was the most meaningful trip, or what do you remember, like what are the things that stick out? And there were a bunch of things a trip to Amsterdam and a trip to, we'd get the footage and look at it all and, Portugal, on and on, so and then there were certain episodes he did that we never got to look at just because there aren't enough hours, but there were episodes of that nobody ever talked about that were, and not, if they would do in a season 4 international episodes, maybe two domestic episodes. The domestic episodes were like, can we not spend too much money, and can we not work that hard? Like they were a little bit of a vacation, And so you could also see in looking at footage when he was engaged, from the get-go, and when he was like, okay, it's a food scene, got it, because there were a lot of things that meant a lot to him, and there are some domestic. I mean, I think his West Virginia episode is fantastic, and he went. The first episode he did after the 2016 election was to West Virginia to talk to essentially Trump voters to try and understand, and it's a fantastic episode, and I had a whole scene about it that didn't make the film, but those are the types of things where when he was on a mission, when he really wanted to learn or really had a question or really just had a dream to go someplace, then that's all the stuff we went through, and it was a lot.
And the propulsiveness of the opening montage that is, fast, and, how did you arrive at that? And I love all the Easter eggs that, we see 400 blows, and we see, 8.5 for Federico Fellini's
Bergman,
film.
there are a bunch of...
And Bergman, The Chest, yeah.
I mean, those are all movies Tony loved, and even throwing in, well, I guess it's later things, American Friend and Aguirre, Wrath of God, and...
Yeah, but I love the fact that it's like the stream of consciousness almost, this montage is just...
Well, I feel like Tony was always such a kind of a collagist too, in terms of his tastes, and kind of how he wanted to deal with things. And he even, when he would do episodes later on, when he really had more control, more budget, more ambition with the show, by parts unknown, when they would go to a place like Rome, he would send them, send his crew, The Conformist, the Antonioni film, and say, this episode, think about this movie. So they actually shot it anamorphically, you know, the Rome episode. When he went to Boston, he sent them The Friends of Eddie Coyle. You know, he would find something cinematically that kind of gave him a filter to do an episode, which I do that all the time. So I totally love that about it. But it was that, again, seeing everything through, you know, the imagining of, you know, it's the thing he talks about in the beginning. He's seen all these movies. He's seen the pirate movies, you know, like, is it going to match up to what he always imagined through his life of consuming books and movies and music? And so I just wanted to reflect all that back.
And just last question, I got so much out of watching this film. What was your ultimate, you know, you want people to take away from seeing Roadrunner?
I mean, I think there are kind of two takeaways for me. There was the initial takeaway, which is what I always loved about him, which is there was no better advocate for curiosity than him. I mean, as he says, it's his one redeeming feature to Iggy Pop on the beach, you know, but curiosity it's a natural resource that we need. And there's a cultural deficit of it, I think, everywhere. And so just the idea of getting outside of your own experience, getting a passport, traveling, talking to people you don't agree with, going to places and being surprised, changing your mind. I mean, all these kinds of things. He got a tattoo that said, in ancient Greek, I'm certain of nothing. You know, he had this kind of, I mean, he was a seeker, you know, and I think there's something that is great about it for most of us. I think there's something you can overdo it, which Tony did because he overdid everything. But I just think as being an advocate, an ambassador for curiosity, I guess is one thing. And the other thing is the personal part of what you learn of making a film and hopefully watching a film about somebody dealing with all these issues and kind of the tragedy of not understanding how much people love you. I mean, it's kind of what Iggy Pop says to him, you know, that what really thrills him at this stage of his life is being loved and showing appreciation to the people who give it to him. And I think that's, in many ways for me, the tragedy of it is so many people loved him so much, but part of being a person in perpetual motion is that you're not hanging on to things. You're always trying to grab the next thing. And if you're really certain of nothing at a certain age, there's something kind of tragic about that. Because there are things you should be certain of, you know, the love of people who care for you, you know, what Iggy said. So hopefully, you know, these films in their own way make people think about those
you
issues.
know, the family and his close friends have seen the film, and what has been the reaction?
It's been really good. I mean, but in a way of like, I mean, it's hard, you know, it's not, but to a person, they've all been really supportive of the film. And, you know, one of them said Tony would have loved this begrudgingly.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you, first of all, for making the film, for being here, and this is the first time we've gathered, and it's so special.
That is great.
That is you and your film. Thank you so much. It means a lot.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.